This is Global Investment Watch, and my name is John Richardson. Today I have with me Carol Chodroff, who is the U.S. Program Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch, where she focuses on criminal and juvenile justice, immigration policy, and counterterrorism. Carol, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Today I'd like to talk a bit about Guantanamo Bay. Ms. Chodroff has visited Guantanamo Bay 3 times in the past several years and has attended several trials and pretrial hearings for prisoners located there. And today I've asked her to join us to share in her experiences in Guantanamo. If we could start off, I'd like to ask you up front, what was your purpose in going to Guantanamo?
My purpose was to go there as a non-governmental organization observer of the Military Commission hearings. Human Rights Watch is one of 5 non-governmental organizations that's been granted the authority to go and monitor the hearings to try and promote some sort of transparency in this process that's been shrouded in secrecy. So my role is to go there as an observer. I was there actually 2 pretrial hearings for Ibrahim Al-Kosi and for Mr. Kameen, and those were both pretrial. One was an arraignment and one was a hearing on the issue of counsel and representation. Those were back in May. Subsequently, I was there to observe I say trial. I don't deem it to be a legitimate trial, and that it wasn't a legitimate court of law, but it was the trial for Salim Hamdan. And then finally, I was there for the trial of Mr. Al-Balul right before the election. Well, the first trial I observed was that of Salim Hamdan, and in his case, this was the second time he'd been charged by the military commission system. The first time, his case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court slapped the Bush administration down and deemed the military commission system unconstitutional, and then subsequently, the administration went to Congress and asked for the authority, and under the Military Commission Act, which was enacted, the second system was set up. So Mr. Hamdan was charged once again, and his trial did nothing to undo the damage that has been done by the Military Commission system in undermining America's image as a champion of human rights and the rule of law. Our reputation internationally has suffered so much because of Guantanamo. What was very unique in Hamdan's case, and frankly in all these cases, is that the U.S. government asserted the authority even if Mr. Hamdan had been acquitted of all charges and found innocent. They asserted the authority to detain him indefinitely until the end of the war on terror. So it was pretty ironic that we ended up just calling it a show trial because it was all for naught. And then they were extremely overzealous and prosecuted. They said 30 years to life, and the commissioners, to their credit, they did review the evidence, and he ended up getting basically the equivalent of 5 months. He was sentenced to 66 months, but he'd already served 61. Mr. Hamdan was charged with, there were a couple different charges. He was acquitted of some, but it was, material support for terrorism, and he was essentially being charged for being the driver for Osama bin Laden. But it was also, they also charged him with conspiracy to commit terrorism, but he was acquitted of that. That was the most serious allegation. And then the second was material support to terrorism for being Osama bin Laden's driver. And he was found guilty of that.
Defendants in these criminal proceedings don't necessarily have a right to access the evidence against them as we would normally expect in a court of law in the United States. Could you describe some of the procedural problems that Mr. Hamdan and other defendants were facing?
Yes. I mean, there are a number of, the lack of due process in the military commission's hearings is a tremendous problem. Evidence that's been obtained by torture is deemed admissible in these courts. Hearsay is admissible. The entire process is shrouded in secrecy. In Hamdan's case, it was just unbelievable. At one point, there was an opinion that was so heavily redacted. I, in fact, have a copy on my wall because it's just pages and pages of black ink. It's a sea of black ink. You can't see a word. The Bush administration has tried to claim that there's complete transparency in these proceedings, and yet, it's shrouded in secrecy. This evidence is deemed classified. In one of the proceedings, there was a reporter from one of the newspapers who requested that the opinion, and there were several times when we were kicked out of the courtroom because testimony was deemed classified. We weren't allowed to hear it. So one of the reporters said, look, we'd like the information released. The public, the American public has a right to transparency. There's supposed to be fully fair and open proceedings. And we were all kicked out, and the judge responded that, look, he didn't have the authority. It was all up to the Pentagon. So, it's not, there's a lack of access to defense evidence. There's a lack of due process. There's a lack of transparency and fairness.
What were the physical circumstances in Guantanamo? Did you find in the prisoners that you observed that they were being well treated or that they were in poor condition? What was your observation in that respect?
The first trial that the first pretrial hearing that I saw was the arraignment of Mr. Kameen, and he was brought to court under the Military Commission Act. An individual does not have the right to boycott the initial arraignment. Later, a detainee could say, I don't want to show up to court, and they can boycott, but you have to go to your initial arraignment. So this was back in May. So Kameen's first arraignment, he tried to boycott. He didn't want to go. And Mohammed Kameen is this small, thin, frail man, approximately 30 years old, and he showed up to court, and he showed up because he'd been forcibly extracted. The judge signed a forcible extraction order, which authorized the guards to forcibly drag him to court. And when he showed up, he was in handcuffs and shackles, and he had cuts and scrapes on his neck and chin, and his right eye was swollen.
What kinds of problems do you see that prosecutors are going to face if, in fact, these detainees are brought to trial in a legitimate court of law?
Our position is that the individuals who should be tried, who shouldn't be released, can be tried in legitimate courts of law. And, certainly you do hear the problem that, look, there's so much evidence now that's been tainted because of torture that's problematic. But, really, we believe there's so much evidence out there that there is sufficient evidence to prosecute individuals in courts of law. The second trial I observed for Al-Balul, it was interesting. Not a single piece of evidence was classified. There is absolutely no reason that trial could not have been held in a legitimate court where the American people, the victims of 9/11, the victims of the USS Cole, could have had faith in the verdict.
Maybe we could speak a little bit then about what your final analysis is of this in terms of the fundamental flaws, and maybe we could just touch on some of those elements very briefly with the tribunal system in Guantanamo.
Sort of hard to know where to start, but basically the absence of any adherence whatsoever to the United States Constitution, the absolute lack of due process, the secrecy that is this dark cloud that hangs over the entire process, the torture and the evidence that's been obtained by torture, use of that, the hearsay that's admitted, the conditions in which people have been held. The whole process just cuts against what the values upon which this country is founded.
Right.
I hope that the next process that we set up is not new, that we don't, it's not an onshore Guantanamo, but that we will have a process that restores the rule of law and can begin to help this country heal again and restore our moral authority throughout the world, a process based on justice.
Well, that about wraps up for the day. Carol, thank you for joining us. This is Global Investment Watch, and I am John Richardson. Thanks for listening.